Chapter 41 of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 41. From the foregoing events of the winter time let us press on to an October day, more than 8 months subsequent to the parting of Clare and Tess. We discover the latter in changed condition. Instead of a bride with boxes and trunks which others bore, we see her a lonely woman, with a basket and a bundle in her own porterage, as in an earlier time when she was no bride. Instead of the ample means that were projected by her husband for her comfort through this probationary period, she can produce only a flattened purse. After again leaving Marlott, her home, she had got through the spring and summer without any great stress upon her physical powers, the time being mainly spent in rendering light irregular service at dairy work near Port Bredy to the west of the Blackmore Valley, equally remote from her native place and from Talbothays. She preferred this to living on his allowance. Mentally she remained in utter stagnation, a condition which the mechanical occupation rather fostered than checked. Her consciousness was at that other dairy, at that other season, in the presence of the tender lover who had confronted her there, he who the moment she had grasped him to keep for her own had disappeared like a shape in a vision. The dairy work lasted only till the milk began to lessen, for she had not met with a second regular engagement as at Talbothays, but had done duty as a supernumerary only. However, as harvest was now beginning, she had simply to remove from the pasture to the stubble to find plenty of further occupation, and this continued till harvest was done. Of the £25 which remained to her of Clare's allowance, after deducting the other half of the 50 as a contribution to her parents for the trouble and expense to which she had put them, she had as yet spent but little. But there now followed an unfortunate interval of wet weather, during which she was obliged to fall back upon her sovereigns. She could not bear to let them go. Angel had put them into her hand, had obtained them bright and new from his bank for her. His touch had consecrated them to souvenirs of himself. They appeared to have had as yet no other history than such as was created by his and her own experiences, and to disperse them was like giving away relics. But she had to do it, and one by one they left her hands. She had been compelled to send her mother her address from time to time, but she concealed her circumstances. When her money had almost gone, a letter from her mother reached her. Joan stated they were in terrible difficulty. The autumn rains had gone through the thatch of the house, which required entire renewal, but this could not be done because the previous thatching had never been paid for. New rafters and a new ceiling upstairs also were required, which with the previous bill would amount to the sum of £20. As her husband was a man of means, and had doubtless returned by this time, could she not send them the money? Tess had £30 coming to her almost immediately from Angel's bankers, and the case being so deplorable, as soon as the sum was received she sent the 20 as requested. Part of the remainder she was obliged to expend in winter clothing, leaving only a nominal sum for the whole inclement season at hand. When the last pound had gone, a remark of Angel's that whenever she required further resources she was to apply to his father remained to be considered. But the more Tess thought of the step, the more reluctant was she to take it. The same delicacy, pride, false shame, whatever it may be called, on Clare's account, which had led her to hide from her own parents the prolongation of the estrangement, hindered her in owning to his that she was in want after the fair allowance he had left her. They probably despised her already. How much more they would despise her in the character of a mendicant. The consequence was that by no effort could the parson's daughter-in-law bring herself to let him know her state. Her reluctance to communicate with her husband's parents might, she thought, lessen with the lapse of time, but with her own the reverse obtained. On her leaving their house after the short visit subsequent to her marriage, they were under the impression that she was ultimately going to join her husband, and from that time to the present she had done nothing to disturb their belief that she was awaiting his return in comfort, hoping against hope that his journey to Brazil would result in a short stay only, after which he would come to fetch her, or that he would write for her to join him. In any case, that they would soon present a united front to their families and the world. This hope she still fostered. To let her parents know that she was a deserted wife, dependent, now that she had relieved their necessities, on her own hands for a living, after the éclat of a marriage which was to nullify the collapse of the first attempt, would be too much indeed. The set of brilliants returned to her mind. Where Clare had deposited them she did not know, and it mattered little if it were true that she could only use them and not sell them. Even were they absolutely hers, it would be passing mean to enrich herself by a legal title to them which was not essentially hers at all. Meanwhile her husband's days had been by no means free from trial. At this moment he was lying ill of fever in the clay lands near Curitiba in Brazil, having been drenched with thunderstorms and persecuted by other hardships, in common with all the English farmers and farm labourers who, just at this time, were deluded into going thither by the promises of the Brazilian government, and by the baseless assumption that those frames which, ploughing and sowing on English uplands, had resisted all the weathers to whose moods they had been born, could resist equally well all the weathers by which they were surprised on Brazilian plains. To return. Thus it happened that when the last of Tess's sovereigns had been spent, she was unprovided with to take their place, while on account of the season she found it increasingly difficult to get employment. Not being aware of the rarity of intelligence, energy, health and willingness in any sphere of life, she refrained from seeking an indoor occupation, fearing towns, large houses, people of means and social sophistication, and of manners other than rural. From that direction of gentility black care had come. Society might be better than she supposed from her slight experience of it, but she had no proof of this, and her instinct in the circumstances was to avoid its purlieus. The small dairies to the west, beyond Port Bredy, in which she had served as supernumerary milkmaid during the spring and summer, required no further aid. Room would probably have been made for her at Talbothays, if only out of sheer compassion, but comfortable as her life had been there, she could not go back. The anticlimax would be too intolerable, and her return might bring reproach upon her idolized husband. She could not have borne their pity, and their whispered remarks to one another upon her strange situation, though she would almost have faced a knowledge of her circumstance by every individual there, so long as her story had remained isolated in the mind of each. It was the interchange of ideas about her that made her sensitiveness wince. Tess could not account for this distinction. She simply knew that she felt it. She was now on her way to an upland farm in the centre of the county, to which she had been recommended by a wandering letter which had reached her from Marian. Marian had somehow heard that Tess was separated from her husband, probably through Izz Huett, and the good-natured and now tippling girl, deeming Tess in trouble, had hastened to notify to her former friend that she herself had gone to this upland spot after leaving the dairy, and would like to see her there, where there was room for other hands, if it were really true that she worked again as of old. With the shortening of the days all hope of obtaining her husband's forgiveness began to leave her, and there was something of the habitude of the wild animal in the unreflecting instinct with which she rambled on, disconnecting her by littles from her eventful past at every step, obliterating her identity, giving no thought to accidents or contingencies which might make a quick discovery of her whereabouts by others of importance to her own happiness, if not to theirs. Among the difficulties of her lonely position, not the least was the attention she excited by her appearance, a certain bearing of distinction which she had caught from Clare being superadded to her natural attractiveness. Whilst the clothes lasted which had been prepared for her marriage, these casual glances of interest caused her no inconvenience, but as soon as she was compelled to don the wrapper of a field woman, rude words were addressed to her more than once, but nothing occurred to cause her bodily fear till a particular November afternoon. She had preferred the country west of the River Brit to the upland farm for which she was now bound, because, for one thing, it was nearer to the home of her husband's father, and to hover about that region unrecognized, with the notion that she might decide to call at the vicarage some day, gave her pleasure. But having once decided to try the higher and drier levels, she pressed back eastward, marching afoot toward the village of Chalk Newton, where she meant to pass the night. The lane was long and unvaried, and, owing to the rapid shortening of the days, dusk came upon her before she was aware. She had reached the top of a hill down which the lane stretched its serpentine length in glimpses, when she heard footsteps behind her back, and in a moment she was overtaken by a man. He stepped up alongside Tess and said, "Good night, my pretty maid," to which she civilly replied. The light still remaining in the sky lit up her face, though the landscape was nearly dark. The man turned round and stared hard at her. "Why, surely it is the young wench who was at Trantridge a while, young Squire d'Urberville's friend. I was there at that time, though I don't live there now." She recognized in him the well-to-do boor whom Angel had knocked down at the inn for addressing her coarsely. A spasm of anguish shot through her, and she returned him no answer. "Be honest enough to own it, that what I said in the town was true, though your fancy man was so up about it. Eh, my sly one? You ought to beg my pardon for that blow of his, considering." Still no answer came from Tess. There seemed only one escape for her hunted soul. She suddenly took to her heels with the speed of the wind, and without looking behind her ran along the road till she came to a gate which opened directly into a plantation. Into this she plunged, and did not pause till she was deep enough in its shade to be safe against any possibility of discovery. Underfoot the leaves were dry, and the foliage of some holly bushes which grew among the deciduous trees was dense enough to keep off draughts. She scraped together the dead leaves till she had formed them into a large heap, making a sort of nest in the middle. Into this Tess crept. Such sleep as she got was naturally fitful. She fancied she heard strange noises, but persuaded herself that they were caused by the breeze. She thought of her husband in some vague warm clime on the other side of the globe, while she was here in the cold. Was there another such wretched being as she in the world? Tess asked herself, and thinking of her wasted life said, "All is vanity." She repeated the words mechanically till she reflected that this was a most inadequate thought for modern days. Solomon had thought as far as that more than 2000 years ago. She herself, though not in the van of thinkers, had got much further. If all were only vanity, who would mind it? All was, alas, worse than vanity. Injustice, punishment, exaction, death. The wife of Angel Clare put her hand to her brow and felt its curve, and the edge of her eye sockets perceptible under the soft skin, and thought as she did so that a time would come when that bone would be bare. "I wish it were now," she said. In the midst of these whimsical fancies she heard a new strange sound among the leaves. It might be the wind, yet there was scarcely any wind. Sometimes it was a palpitation, sometimes a flutter, sometimes it was a sort of gasp or gurgle. Soon she was certain that the noises came from wild creatures of some kind, the more so when, originating in the boughs overhead, they were followed by the fall of a heavy body upon the ground. Had she been ensconced here under other and more pleasant conditions, she would have become alarmed, but outside humanity she had at present no fear. Day at length broke in the sky. When it had been day aloft for some little while, it became day in the wood. Directly the assuring and prosaic life of the world's active hours had grown strong, she crept from under her hillock of leaves and looked around boldly. Then she perceived what had been going on to disturb her. The plantation wherein she had taken shelter ran down at this spot into a peak which ended it hitherward, outside the hedge being arable ground. Under the trees several pheasants lay about, their rich plumage dabbled with blood. Some were dead, some feebly twitching a wing, some staring up at the sky, some pulsating quickly, some contorted, some stretched out. All of them writhing in agony, except the fortunate ones whose tortures had ended during the night by the inability of nature to bear more. Tess guessed at once the meaning of this. The birds had been driven down into this corner the day before by some shooting party, and while those that had dropped dead under the shot, or had died before nightfall, had been searched for and carried off, many badly wounded birds had escaped and hidden themselves away, or risen among the thick boughs, where they had maintained their position till they grew weaker with loss of blood in the night time, when they had fallen one by one as she had heard them. She had occasionally caught glimpses of these men in girlhood, looking over hedges or peering through bushes, and pointing their guns, strangely accoutred, a bloodthirsty light in their eyes. She had been told that rough and brutal as they seemed just then, they were not like this all the year round, but were in fact quite civil persons, save during certain weeks of autumn and winter, when, like the inhabitants of the Malay Peninsula, they ran amok and made it their purpose to destroy life. In this case, harmless feathered creatures, brought into being by artificial means solely to gratify these propensities, at once so unmannerly and so unchivalrous toward their weaker fellows in nature's teeming family. With the impulse of a soul who could not feel for kindred sufferers as much as for herself, Tess's first thought was to put the still living birds out of their torture, and to this end with her own hands she broke the necks of as many as she could find, leaving them to lie where she had found them till the gamekeepers should come, as they probably would come, to look for them a second time. Poor darlings! To suppose myself the most miserable being on earth in the sight of such misery as yours!" she exclaimed, her tears running down as she killed the birds tenderly. "And not a twinge of bodily pain about me. I be not mangled, and I be not bleeding, and I have 2 hands to feed and clothe me." She was ashamed of herself for her gloom of the night, based on nothing more tangible than a sense of condemnation under an arbitrary law of society which had no foundation in nature. End of chapter 41. Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 42. It was now broad day, and she started again, emerging cautiously upon the highway. But there was no need for caution, not a soul was at hand, and Tess went onward with fortitude, her recollection of the birds' silent endurance of their night of agony impressing upon her the relativity of sorrows and the tolerable nation of her own, if she could once rise high enough to despise opinion, but that she could not do so long as it was held by Clare. She reached Chalk Newton, and breakfasted at an inn where several young men were troublesomely complimentary to her good looks. Somehow she felt hopeful, for was it not possible that her husband also might say these same things to her even yet? She was bound to take care of herself on the chance of it, and to keep off these casual lovers. To this end Tess resolved to run no further risks from her appearance. As soon as she got out of the village she entered a thicket, and took from her basket one of the oldest field gowns, which she had never put on even at the dairy, never since she had worked among the stubble at Marlott. She also, by a felicitous thought, took a handkerchief from her bundle and tied it round her face under her bonnet, covering her chin and half her cheeks and temples, as if she was suffering from toothache. Then, with her little scissors, by the aid of a pocket looking-glass, she mercilessly nipped her eyebrows off, and thus insured against aggressive admiration, she went on her uneven way. "What a muppet of a maid!" said the next man who met her to a companion. Tears came into her eyes for very pity of herself as she had heard him. "But I don't care," she said. "Oh no, I don't care. I'll always be ugly now because Angel is not here, and I have nobody to take care of me. My husband that was is gone away, and never will love me any more. But I love him just the same, and hate all other men, and like to make 'em think scornfully of me." Thus Tess walks on, a figure which is part of the landscape, a field woman, pure and simple, in winter guise, a grey serge cap, a red woollen cravat, a stuff skirt covered by a whitey-brown rough wrapper, and buff leather gloves. Every thread of that old attire has become faded and thin under the stroke of raindrops, the burn of sunbeams, and the stress of winds. There is no sign of young passion in her now. The maiden's mouth is cold, fold over simple fold, binding her head. Inside this exterior, over which the eye might have roved, as over a thing scarcely percipient, almost inorganic, there was the record of a pulsating life which had learned too well for its years of the dust and ashes of things, of the cruelty of lust and the fragility of love. Next day the weather was bad, but she trudged on, the honesty, directness, and impartiality of elemental enmity disconcerting her but little. Her object being a winter's occupation and a winter's home, there was no time to lose. Her experience of short hirings had been such that she was determined to accept no more. Thus she went forward from farm to farm in the direction of the place whence Marian had written to her, which she determined to make use of as a last shift only, its rumoured stringencies being the reverse of tempting. First she inquired for the lighter kinds of employment, and, as acceptance of any variety of those grew hopeless, applied for the less light, till, beginning with the dairy and poultry tendance that she liked best, she ended with the heavy and coarse pursuits which she liked least, work on arable land, work of such roughness indeed as she would never have deliberately volunteered for. Towards the second evening she reached the irregular chalk tableland or plateau, bosomed with semi-globular tumuli, as if Sybil the many-breasted was supinely extended there, which stretched between the valley of her birth and the valley of her love. Here the air was dry and cold, and the long cart roads were blown white and dusty within a few hours after rain. There were few trees, or none, those that would have grown in the hedges being mercilessly plashed down with the quickset by the tenant farmers, the natural enemies of tree, brush and brake. In the middle distance ahead of her she could see the summits of Bulbarrow and Nettlecombe Tout, and they seemed friendly. They had a low and unassuming aspect from this upland, though as approached on the other side from Blackmoor in her childhood they were as lofty bastions against the sky. Southerly, at many miles' distance, and over the hills and ridges coastward, she could discern a surface like polished steel. It was the English Channel, at a point far out towards France. Before her, in a slight depression, were the remains of a village. She had in fact reached Flintcomb Ash, the place of Marian's sojourn. There seemed to be no help for it. Hither she was doomed to come. The stubborn soil around her showed plainly enough that the kind of labour in demand here was of the roughest kind. But it was time to rest from searching, and she resolved to stay, particularly as it began to rain. At the entrance to the village was a cottage whose gable jutted into the road, and before applying for a lodging she stood under its shelter and watched the evening close in. "Who would think I was Mrs. Angel Clare?" she said. The wall felt warm to her back and shoulders, and she found that immediately within the gable was the cottage fireplace, the heat of which came through the bricks. She warmed her hands upon them, and also put her cheek, red and moist with the drizzle, against their comforting surface. The wall seemed to be the only friend she had. She had so little wish to leave it that she could have stayed there all night. Tess could hear the occupants of the cottage, gathered together after their day's labour, talking to each other within, and the rattle of their supper plates was also audible. But in the village street she had seen no soul as yet. The solitude was at last broken by the approach of one feminine figure, who, though the evening was cold, wore the print gown and the tilt bonnet of summer-time. Tess instinctively thought it might be Marian, and when she came near enough to be distinguishable in the gloom, surely enough it was she. Marian was even stouter and redder in the face than formerly, and decidedly shabbier in attire. At any previous period of her existence Tess would hardly have cared to renew the acquaintance in such conditions, but her loneliness was aggressive, and she responded readily to Marian's greeting. Marian was quite respectful in her inquiries, but seemed much moved by the fact that Tess should still continue in no better condition than at first, though she had dimly heard of the separation. "Tess, Mrs. Clare, the dear wife of dear he! And is it really so bad as this, my child? Why is your comely face tied up in such a way? Anybody been beating 'ee? Not he?" "No, no, no. I merely did it not to be clipsed or called, Marian." She pulled off in disgust a bandage which could suggest such wild thoughts. "And you've got no collar on." Tess had been accustomed to wear a little white collar at the dairy. "I know it, Marian." "You've lost it travelling." "I've not lost it. The truth is I don't care anything about my looks, so I didn't put it on." "And you don't wear your wedding ring?" "Yes, I do, but not in public. I wear it round my neck on a ribbon. I don't wish people to think who I am by marriage, or that I am married at all. It would be so awkward while I lead my present life." Marian paused. "But you be a gentleman's wife, and it seems hardly fair that you should live like this." "Oh yes, it is. Quite fair, though I am very unhappy." "Well, well, he married you, and you can be unhappy." "Wives are unhappy sometimes, from no fault of their husbands, from their own." "You've got no faults, dearie, that I'm sure of, and he's none, so it must be something outside ye both." "Marian, dear Marian, will you do me a good turn without asking questions? My husband has gone abroad, and somehow I have overrun my allowance, so that I have had to fall back upon my own work for a time. Do not call me Mrs. Clare, but Tess, as before. Do they want a hand there?" "Oh yes, they'll take one always, because few care to come. 'Tis a starve-acre place. Corn and swedes are all they grow.
Though I be here myself, I fear 'tis a pity for such as you to come." "But you used to be as good a dairywoman as I." "Yes, but I've got out of that since I took to drink. Lord, that's the only comfort I've got now. But if you engage, you'll be set swede hacking. That's what I be doing, and you won't like it." "Oh, anything. Will you speak for me?" "You will do better by speaking for yourself." "Very well. Now, Marian, remember, nothing about him if I get the place. I don't wish to bring his name down to the dirt."
Marian, who was really a trustworthy girl, though of courser grain than Tess, promised anything she asked.
"This is pay night," she said, "and if you were to come with me you would know at once. I be real sorry that you are not happy, but 'tis because he's away, I know. You couldn't be unhappy if he was here, even if he gid thee no money, even if he used you like a drudge."
"That's true. I could not." They walked on together, and soon reached the farmhouse, which was almost sublime in its dreariness. There was not a tree within sight. There was not at this season a green pasture, nothing but fallow and turnips everywhere, in large fields divided by hedges, plashed to unrelieved levels. Tess waited outside the door of the farmhouse till the group of workfolk had received their wages, and then Marian introduced her. The farmer himself, it appeared, was not at home, but his wife, who represented him this evening, made no objection to hiring Tess, on her agreeing to remain till Old Lady Day. Female field labour was seldom offered now, and its cheapness made it profitable for tasks which women could perform as readily as men. Having signed the agreement, there was nothing more for Tess to do at present than to get a lodging, and she found one in the house at whose gable wall she had warmed herself. It was a poor subsistence that she had ensured, but it would afford a shelter for the winter at any rate. That night she wrote to inform her parents of her new address, in case a letter should arrive at Marlott from her husband. But she did not tell them of the sorriness of her situation. It might have brought reproach upon him. End of chapter 42. Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 43. There was no exaggeration in Marian's definition of Flintcomb Ash Farm as a starve-acre place. The single fat thing on the soil was Marian herself, and she was an importation. Of the three classes of village, the village cared for by its lord, the village cared for by itself, and the village uncared for either by itself or by its lord, in other words, the village of a resident squire's tenantry, the village of free or copyholders, and the absentee owner's village farmed with land, this place, Flintcomb Ash, was the third. But Tess set to work. Patience, that blending of moral courage and physical timidity, was now no longer a minor feature in Mrs. Angel Clare, and it sustained her. The swede field in which she and her companion were set hacking was a stretch of 100-odd acres in one patch, on the highest ground of the farm, rising above stony lanchets or lynchets, the outcrop of silicous veins in the chalk formation, composed of myriads of loose white flints in bulbous, cusped and phallic shapes. The upper half of each turnip had been eaten off by the livestock, and it was the business of the two women to grub up the lower or earthy half of the root with a hooked fork called a hacker, that it might be eaten also. Every leaf of the vegetable having already been consumed, the whole field was in colour a desolate drab. It was a complexion without features, as if a face, from chin to brow, should be only an expanse of skin. The sky wore, in another colour, the same likeness, a white vacuity of countenance, with the lineaments gone. So these two upper and nether visages confronted each other all day long, the white face looking down on the brown face, and the brown face looking up at the white face, without anything standing between them but the two girls crawling over the surface of the former like flies. Nobody came near them, and their movements showed a mechanical regularity, their forms standing enshrouded in Hessian wroppers, sleeved brown pinafores tied behind to the bottom to keep their gowns from blowing about, scant skirts revealing boots that reached high up the ankles, and yellow sheepskin gloves with gauntlets. The pensive character which the curtained hood lent to their bent heads would have reminded the observer of some early Italian conception of the two Marys. They worked on hour after hour, unconscious of the forlorn aspect they bore on the landscape, not thinking of the justice or injustice of their lot. Even in such a position as theirs it was possible to exist in a dream. In the afternoon the rain came on again, and Marian said that they need not work any more. But if they did not work they would not get paid, so they worked on. It was so high a situation, this field, that the rain had on no occasion to fall, but raced along horizontally upon the yelling wind, sticking into them like glass splinters till they were wet through. Tess had not known till now what was really meant by that. There are degrees of dampness, and a very little is called being wet through in common talk. But to stand working slowly in a field and feel the creep of rainwater, first on legs and shoulders, then on hips and head, then at back, front and sides, and yet to work on till the leaden light diminishes and marks that the sun is down, demands a distinct modicum of stoicism, even of valour. Yet they did not feel the wetness so much as might be supposed. They were both young, and they were talking of the time when they lived and loved together at Talbothays Dairy, that happy green tract of land where summer had been liberal in her gifts, in substance to all, emotionally to these. Tess would fain not have conversed with Marian of the man who was legally, if not actually, her husband, but the irresistible fascination of the subject betrayed her into reciprocating Marian's remarks. And thus, as it has been said, though the damp curtains of their bonnets flapped smartly into their faces, and their wrappers clung about them to wearisomeness, they lived all this afternoon in memories of green, sunny, romantic Talbothays. "You can see a gleam of a hill within a few miles of Froom Valley from here when 'tis fine," said Marian. "Ah, can you?" said Tess, awake to the new value of this locality. So the two forces were at work here as everywhere, the inherent will to enjoy and the circumstantial will against enjoyment. Marian's will had a method of assisting itself by taking from her pocket, as the afternoon wore on, a pint bottle corked with a white rag, from which she invited Tess to drink. Tess's unassisted power of dreaming, however, being enough for her sublimation at present, she declined, except the merest sip, and then Marian took a pull herself from the spirits. "I've got used to it," she said, "and can't leave it off now. 'Tis my only comfort. You see, I lost him. You didn't, and you can do without it perhaps." Tess thought her loss as great as Marian's, but upheld by the dignity of being Angel's wife, in the letter at least, she accepted Marian's differentiation. Amid this scene Tess slaved in the morning frosts and in the afternoon rains. When it was not swede grubbing, it was swede trimming, in which process they sliced off the earth and the fibres with a bill-hook before storing the roots for future use. At this occupation they could shelter themselves by a thatched hurdle if it rained, but if it was frosty, even their thick leather gloves could not prevent the frozen masses they handled from biting their fingers. Still Tess hoped. She had a conviction that sooner or later the magnanimity which she persisted in reckoning as a chief ingredient of Clare's character would lead him to rejoin her. Marian, primed to a humorous mood, would discover the queer-shaped flints aforesaid and shriek with laughter, Tess remaining severely obtuse. They often looked across the country to where the Var or Froom was known to stretch, even though they might not be able to see it, and fixing their eyes on the cloaking grey mist, imagined the old times that they had spent out there. "Ah," said Marian, "how I should like another or two of our old set to come here, when we could bring up Talbothays every day here afield, and talk of of what nice times we had there, and all the things we used to know, and make it all come back again a'most, in seeming." Marian's eyes softened, and her voice grew vague as the visions returned. "I'll write to Izz Hewitt," she said. "She's biding at home doing nothing now, I know. And I'll tell her we be here, and ask her to come, and perhaps Retty is well enough now." Tess had nothing to say against this proposal, and the next she heard of the plan for importing old Talbothays joys was 2 or 3 days later, when Marian informed her that Izz had replied to her inquiry and had promised to come if she could. There had not been such a winter for years. It came on in steadily and measured glides, like the moves of a chess player. One morning the few lonely trees and the thorns of the hedgerows appeared as if they had put off a vegetable for an animal integument. Every twig was covered with a white nap, as of fur grown from the rind during the night, giving it 4 or 5 times its usual stoutness, the whole bush or tree forming a staring sketch in white lines on the mournful grey of the sky and horizon. Cobwebs revealed their presence on sheds and walls where none had been observed, till brought out into visibility by the crystallizing atmosphere, hanging like loops of white worsted from salient points of the outhouses, posts and gates. After this season of congealed dampness came a spell of dry frost, when strange birds from behind the North Pole began to arrive silently on the upland of Flintcomb Ash. Gaunt spectral creatures with tragical eyes which had witnessed scenes of cataclysmal horror in inaccessible polar regions of a magnitude such as no human being has ever conceived, in curdling temperatures that no man could endure, which had beheld the crash of icebergs and the slide of snow hills by the shooting light of the aurora, been half blinded by the whirl of colossal storms and terraqueous distortions, and retained the expression of feature such scenes had engendered. These nameless birds came quite near to Tess and Marian, but of all they had seen which humanity would never see, they brought no account. The traveller's ambition to tell was not theirs, and with dumb impassivity they dismissed experiences which they did not value for the immediate incidents of this homely upland. The trivial movements of the 2 girls in disturbing the clods with their hackers so as to uncover something or other that these visitants relished as food. Then one day a peculiar quality invaded the air of this open country. There came a moisture which was not of rain, and a cold which was not of frost. It chilled the eyeballs of the twain, made their brows ache, penetrated to their skeletons, affecting the surface of the body less than its core. They knew that it meant snow, and in the night the snow came. Tess, who continued to live at the cottage with the warm gable that cheered any lonely pedestrian who paused beside it, awoke in the night and heard above the thatch noises which seemed to signify that the roof had turned itself into a gymnasium of all the winds. When she lit her lamp to get up in the morning, she found that the snow had been blown through a chink in the casement, forming a white cone of the finest powder against the inside, and had also come down the chimney, so that it lay sole deep upon the floor, on which her shoes left tracks when she moved about. Without, the storm drove so fast as to create a snow mist in the kitchen, but as yet it was too dark out of doors to see anything. Tess knew that it was impossible to go on with the Swedes, and by the time she had finished breakfast beside the solitary little lamp, Marian arrived to tell her that they were to join the rest of the women at reed drawing in the barn till the weather changed. As soon, therefore, as the uniform cloak of darkness without began to turn into a disordered medley of greys, they blew out the lamp, wrapped themselves up in their thickest pinners, tied their woollen cravats round their necks and across their chests, and started for the barn. The snow had followed the birds from the polar basin as a white pillar of a cloud, and individual flakes could not be seen. The blast smelt of icebergs, Arctic seas, whales, and white bears, carrying the snow so that it licked the land but did not deepen on it. They trudged onwards with slanted bodies through the flossy fields, keeping as well as they could in the shelter of hedges, which, however, acted as strainers rather than screens. The air, afflicted to pallor with the hoary multitudes that infested it, twisted and spun them eccentrically, suggesting an achromatic chaos of things. But both the young women were fairly cheerful. Such weather on a dry upland is not in itself dispiriting. "Ah, the cunning northern birds knew this was a-coming," said Marian. "Depend on't. They keep just in front on't all the way from the North Star. Your husband, my dear, is, I make no doubt, having scorching weather all this time. Lord, if he could only see his pretty wife now! Not that this weather hurts your beauty at all. In fact, it rather does it good." "You mustn't talk about him to me, Marian," said Tess severely. "Well, but surely you care for him, do you?" Instead of answering, Tess, with tears in her eyes, impulsively faced in the direction in which she had imagined South America to lie, and putting up her lips, blew out a passionate kiss upon the snowy wind. "Well, well, I know you do, but, 'pon my body, it is a rum life for a married couple. There, I won't say another word. Well, as for the weather, it won't hurt us in the wheat barn, but reed drawing is fearful hard work, worse than swede hacking. I can stand it because I'm stout, but you be slimmer than I. I can't think why Maister should have set 'ee at it." They reached the wheat barn and entered it. One end of the low structure was full of corn. The middle was where the reed drawing was carried on, and there had already been placed in the reed press the evening before as many sheaves of wheat as would be sufficient for the women to draw from during the day. "Why, here's Izz," said Marian. Izz it was, and she came forward. She had walked all the way from her mother's home on the previous afternoon, and, not deeming the distance so great, had been belated, arriving, however, just before the snow began, and sleeping at the alehouse. The farmer had agreed with her mother at market to take her on if she came to-day, and she had been afraid to disappoint him by delay. In addition to Tess, Marian and Izz, there were two women from a neighbouring village, two Amazonian sisters, whom Tess with a start remembered as Dark Car, the Queen of Spades, and her junior, the Queen of Diamonds, those who had tried to fight with her in the midnight quarrel at Trantridge. They showed no recognition of her, and possibly had none, for they had been under the influence of liquor on that occasion, and were only temporary sojourners there as here. They did all kinds of men's work by preference, including well sinking, hedging, ditching, and excavating, without any sense of fatigue. Noted reed drawers they were too, and looked round upon the other three with some superciliousness. Putting on their gloves, all set to work in a row in front of the press, an erection formed of two posts connected by a crossbeam, under which the sheaves to be drawn from were laid ears outward, the beam being pegged down by pins in the uprights, and lowered as the sheaves diminished. The day hardened in colour, the night coming in at the barn doors upwards from the snow instead of downwards from the sky. The girls pulled handful after handful from the press, but by reason of the presence of the strange women who were recounting scandals, Marian and Izz could not at first talk of old times as they wished to do. Presently they heard the muffled tread of a horse, and the farmer rode up to the barn door. When he had dismounted he came close to Tess, and remained looking musingly at the side of her face. She had not turned at first, but his fixed attitude led her to look around, when she perceived that her employer was the native of Trantridge from whom she had taken flight on the high road because of his allusion to her history. He waited till she had carried the drawn bundles to the piles outside, when he said, "So you be the young woman who took my civility in such ill part. Be drowned if I didn't think you might be as soon as I heard of your being hired. Well, you thought you had got the better of me the first time at the inn with your fancy man, and the second time on the road when you bolted, but now I think I've got the better of you," he concluded with a hard laugh. Tess, between the Amazons and the farmer like a bird caught in a clap net, returned no answer, continuing to pull the straw. She could read the character sufficiently well to know by this time that she had nothing to fear from her employer's gallantry. It was rather the tyranny induced by his mortification at Clare's treatment of him. Upon the whole she preferred that sentiment in man, and was brave enough to endure it. "You thought I was in love with 'ee, I suppose. Some women are such fools to take every look as serious earnest. But there's nothing like a winter afield for taking that nonsense out of the young wenches' heads, and you've signed on and agreed till Lady Day. Now, are you going to beg my pardon?" "I think you ought to beg mine." "Very well, as you like it, and we'll see which is master here. Be they all the sheaves you've done to-day?" "Yes, sir." "'Tis a very poor show. Just see what they've done over there," pointing to the two stalwart women. "The rest too have done better than you." "They've all practised it before, and I have not. And I thought it made no difference to you, as it is task work, and we are only paid for what we do." "Oh, but it does. I want the barn cleared." "I'm going to work all afternoon instead of leaving at 2 as the others will do." He looked sullenly at her and went away. Tess felt that she could not have come to a much worse place, but anything was better than gallantry. When 2 o'clock arrived, the professional reed drawers tossed off their last half-pint in their flagon, put down their hooks, tied their last sheaves, and went away. Marian and Izz would have done likewise, but on hearing that Tess meant to stay, to make up by longer hours for her lack of skill, they would not leave her. Looking out at the snow, which still fell, Marian exclaimed, "Now we've got it all to ourselves." And so at last the conversation turned to their old experiences at the dairy, and of course the incidents of their affection for Angel Clare. "Izz and Marian," said Mrs. Angel Clare with a dignity which was extremely touching, seeing how very little of a wife she was, "I can't join in talk with you now as I used to do about Mr. Clare. You will see that I cannot, because though he has gone away from me for the present, he is my husband." Izz was by nature the sauciest and most caustic of all the 4 girls who had loved Clare. "He was a splendid lover, no doubt," she said, "but I don't think he's too fond a husband to go away from you so soon." "He had to go. He was obliged to go, to see about the land over there," pleaded Tess. "He might have tidied it over the winter." "Ah, that's owing to an accident, a misunderstanding, and we won't argue it," Tess answered, with tearfulness in her words. "Perhaps there's a good deal to be said for him. He did not go away like some husbands without telling me, and I can always find out where he is." After this they continued for some long time in a reverie, as they went on seizing the ears of corn, drawing out the straw, gathering it under their arms, and cutting off the ears with their bill-hooks, nothing sounding in the barn but the swish of the straw and the crunch of the hook. Then Tess suddenly flagged, and sank down upon the heap of wheat ears at her feet. "I knew you wouldn't be able to stand it," cried Marian. "It wants harder flesh than yours for this work." Just then the farmer entered. "Oh, that's how you get on while I'm away," he said to her. "But it is my own loss," she pleaded, "not yours." "I want it finished," he said doggedly as he crossed the barn and went out at the other door. "Don't 'ee mind him, there's a dear," said Marian. "I've worked here before. Now you go and lie down there, and Izz and I will make up your number." "I don't like to let you do that. I'm taller than you too." However, she was so overcome that she consented to lie down a while, and reclined on a heap of pull-tails, the refuse after the straight straw had been drawn, thrown up at the further side of the barn. Her succumbing had been as largely owing to agitation at reopening the subject of her separation from her husband as to the hard work. She lay in a state of percipience without volition, and the rustle of the straw and the cutting of the ears by the others had the weight of bodily touches. She could hear from her corner, in addition to these noises, the murmur of their voices. She felt certain that they were continuing the subject already broached, but their voices were so low that she could not catch the words. At last Tess grew more and more anxious to know what they were saying, and persuading herself that she felt better, she got up and resumed work. Then Izz Hewitt broke down. She had walked more than a dozen miles the previous evening, had gone to bed at midnight, and had risen again at 5 o'clock. Marian alone, thanks to her bottle of liquor and her stoutness of build, stood the strain upon back and arms without suffering. Tess urged Izz to leave off, agreeing as she felt better to finish the day without her, and make equal division of the number of sheaves. Izz accepted the offer gratefully, and disappeared through the great door into the snowy tract to her lodging. Marian, as was the case every afternoon at this time on account of the bottle, began to feel in a romantic vein. "I should not have thought it of him, never," she said in a dreamy tone. "And I loved him so. I didn't mind his having you, but this about Izz is too bad." Tess, in her start at the words, narrowly missed cutting off a finger with the bill-hook. "Is it about my husband?" she stammered. "Well, yes. Izz said, 'Don't 'ee tell her,' but I'm sure I can't help it. It was what he wanted Izz to do. He wanted her to go off to Brazil with him." Tess's face faded as white as the scene without, and its curves straightened. "And did Izz refuse to go?" she asked. "I don't know. Anyhow, he changed his mind." "Pooh! Then he didn't mean it. 'Twas just a man's jest." "Yes, he did, for he drove her a good ways toward the station." "He didn't take her?" They pulled on in silence till Tess, without any premonitory symptoms, burst out crying. "There," said Marian. "Now I wish I hadn't told 'ee." "No, it is a very good thing that you have done. I have been living on in a third-over lack-a-day way, and have not seen what it might lead to. I ought to have sent him a letter oftener. He said I could not go to him, but he didn't say I was not to write as often as I liked. I won't dally like this any longer. I have been very wrong and neglectful in leaving everything to be done by him." The dim light in the barn grew dimmer, and they could see to work no longer. When Tess had reached home that evening, and had entered into the privacy of her little whitewashed chamber, she began impetuously writing a letter to Clare. But falling into doubt, she could not finish it. Afterwards she took the ring from the ribbon on which she wore it next to her heart, and retained it on her finger all night, as if to fortify herself with the sensation that she was really the wife of this elusive lover of hers, who could propose that Izz could go with him abroad, so shortly after he had left her. Knowing that, how could she write entreaties to him, or show that she cared for him any more? End of chapter 43. Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 44. By the disclosure in the barn her thoughts were led anew in the direction which they had taken more than once of late, to the distant Emminster vicarage. It was through her husband's parents that she had been charged to send a letter to Clare if she desired, and to write to them direct if in difficulty. But that sense of her having morally no claim upon him had always led Tess to suspend her impulse to send these notes, and to the family at the vicarage, therefore, as to her own parents, since her marriage, she was virtually non-existent. This self-effacement in both directions had been in consonance with her independent character of desiring nothing by way of favour or pity to which she was not entitled on a fair consideration of her deserts. She had set herself to stand or fall by her qualities, and to waive such merely technical claims upon a strange family as had been established for her by the flimsy fact of a member of that family, in a season of impulse, writing his name in a church book beside hers. Now that she was stung to a fever by Izzy's tale, there was a limit to her powers of renunciation. Why had her husband not written to her? He had distinctly implied that he would at least let her know of the locality to which he had journeyed, but he had not sent a line to notify his address. Was he really indifferent? But was he ill? Was it for her to make some advance? Surely she might summon the courage of solicitude, call at the vicarage for intelligence, and express her grief at his silence. If Angel's father were the good man she had heard him represented to be, he would be able to enter into her heart-starved situation. Her social hardships she could conceal. To leave the farm on a weekday was not in her power. Sunday was the only possible opportunity. Flintcomb Ash being in the middle of the Cretaceous tableland over which no railway had climbed as yet, it would be necessary to walk. And the distance being 15 miles each way, she would have to allow herself a long day for the undertaking by rising early. A fortnight later, when the snow had gone, and it had been followed by a hard black frost, she took advantage of the state of the roads to try the experiment. At 4 o'clock that Sunday morning she came downstairs and stepped out into the starlight. The weather was still favourable, the ground ringing under her feet like an anvil. Marian and Izz were much interested in her excursion, knowing that the journey concerned her husband. Their lodgings were in a cottage a little further along the lane, but they came and assisted Tess in her departure, and argued that she should dress up in her very prettiest guise to captivate the hearts of her parents-in-law, though she, knowing of the austere and Calvinistic tenets of old Mr Clare, was indifferent, and even doubtful. A year had now elapsed since her sad marriage, but she had preserved sufficient draperies from the wreck of her then full wardrobe to clothe her very charmingly, as a simple country girl with no pretensions to recent fashion. A soft grey woollen gown, with white crape quilling against the pink skin of her face and neck, and a black velvet jacket and hat. "'Tis 1,000 pities your husband can't see ye now. You do look a real beauty," said Izz Hewitt, regarding Tess as she stood on the threshold between the steely starlight without and the yellow candlelight within. Izz spoke with a magnanimous abandonment of herself to the situation. She could not be, no woman with a heart bigger than a hazelnut could be, antagonistic to Tess in her presence, the influence which she exercised over those of her own sex being of a warmth and strength quite unusual, curiously overpowering the less worthy feminine feelings of spite and rivalry. With a final tug and touch here, and a slight brush there, they let her go, and she was absorbed into the pearly air of the fordawn. They heard her footsteps tap along the hard road as she stepped out to her full pace. Even Izz hoped she would win, and, though without any particular respect for her own virtue, felt glad that she had been prevented from wronging her friend when momentarily tempted by Clare. It was a year ago, all but a day, that Clare had married Tess, and only a few days less than a year than he had been absent from her. Still, to start on a brisk walk, and on such an errand as hers, on a dry, clear, wintry morning, through the rarefied air of those chalky hogbacks, was not depressing, and there was no doubt that her dream at starting was to win the heart of her mother-in-law, tell her whole story to that lady, enlist her on her side, and so gain back the truant. In time she reached the edge of the vast escarpment below which stretched the loamy vale of Blackmoor, now lying misty and still in the dawn. Instead of the colourless air of the uplands, the atmosphere down there was a deep blue. Instead of the great enclosures of 100 acres in which she was now accustomed to toil, there were little fields below her of less than half a dozen acres, so numerous that they looked from this height like the meshes of a net. Here the landscape was whitey brown. Down there, as in Froom Valley, it was always green. Yet it was in that vale that her sorrow had taken place, and she did not love it as formerly. Beauty to her, as to all who have felt, lay not in the thing, but in what the thing symbolized. Keeping the vale on her right, she steered steadily westward, passing above the Hintocks, crossing at right angles the high road from Sherton Abbas to Casterbridge, and skirting Dogbury Hill and High Stoy, with the dell between them called the Devil's Kitchen. Still following the elevated way, she reached Cross in Hand, where the stone pillar stands desolate and silent, to mark the site of a miracle, or murder, or both. 3 miles further she cut across the straight and deserted Roman road called Long Ash Lane, leaving which, as soon as she reached it, she dipped down a hill by a transverse lane into the small town or village of Evershed, being now about halfway over the distance. She made a halt there and breakfasted a second time, heartily enough, not at the Sow and Acorn, for she avoided inns, but at a cottage by the church. The second half of her journey was through a more gentle country, by way of Benville Lane, but as the mileage lessened between her and the spot of her pilgrimage, so did Tess's confidence decrease, and her enterprise loom out more formidably. She saw her purpose in such staring lines, and the landscape so faintly, that she was sometimes in danger of losing her way. However, about noon she paused by a gate on the edge of the basin in which Emminster and its vicarage lay. The square tower, beneath which she knew that at that moment the vicar and his congregation were gathered, had a severe look in her eyes. She wished that she had somehow contrived to come on a weekday. Such a good man might be prejudiced against a woman who had chosen Sunday, never realizing the necessities of her case. But it was incumbent upon her to go on now. She took off the thick boots in which she had walked thus far, put on her pretty thin ones of patent leather, and stuffing the former into the hedge by the gate-post where she might readily find them again, descended the hill. The freshness of colour she had derived from the keen air thinning away in spite of her as she drew near the parsonage. Tess hoped for some accident that might favour her, but nothing favoured her. The shrubs on the vicarage lawn rustled uncomfortably in the frosty breeze. She could not feel by any stretch of imagination, dressed to her highest as she was, that the house was the residence of near relations, and yet nothing essential, in nature or emotion, divided her from them. In pains, pleasures, thoughts, birth, death, and after death, they were the same. She nerved herself by an effort, entered the swing gate, and rang the doorbell. The thing was done. There could be no retreat. No, the thing was not done. Nobody answered to her ringing. The effort had to be risen to and made again. She rang a second time, and the agitation of the act, coupled with her weariness after the 15 miles walk, led her to support herself while she waited by resting her hand on her hip and her elbow against the wall of the porch. The wind was so nipping that the ivy leaves had become wizened and grey, each tapping incessantly upon its neighbour with a disquieting stir of her nerves. A piece of blood-stained paper, caught up from some meat buyer's dust heap, beat up and down the road without the gate, too flimsy to rest, too heavy to fly away, and a few straws kept it company. The second peal had been louder, and still nobody came. Then she walked out of the porch, opened the gate, and passed through, and though she looked dubiously at the house front as if inclined to return, it was with a breath of relief that she closed the gate. A feeling haunted her that she might have been recognized, though how she could not tell, and orders been given not to admit her. Tess went as far as the corner. She had done all she could do, but determined not to escape present trepidation at the expense of future distress, she walked back again quite past the house, looking up at all the windows. Ah, the explanation was that they were all at church, every one. She remembered her husband saying that his father always insisted upon the household, servants included, going to morning service, and as a consequence eating cold food when they came home. It was therefore only necessary to wait till the service was over. She would not make herself conspicuous by waiting on the spot, and she started to get past the church into the lane. But as she reached the churchyard gate, the people began pouring out, and Tess found herself in the midst of them. The Emminster congregation looked at her as only a congregation of small country townsfolk walking home at its leisure can look at a woman out of the common whom it perceives to be a stranger. She quickened her pace, and ascended the road by which she had come, to find a retreat between its hedges till the vicar's family should have lunched, and it might be convenient for them to receive her. She stood distance from the churchgoers, except 2 youngish men who, linked arm in arm, were beating up behind her at a quick step. As they drew near she could hear their voices engaged in earnest discourse, and with the natural quickness of a woman in her situation did not fail to recognize in these noises the quality of her husband's tones. The pedestrians were his 2 brothers. Forgetting her plans, Tess's one dread was lest they should overtake her now in her disorganized condition before she was prepared to confront them, for though she felt that they could not identify her, she instinctively dreaded their scrutiny. The more briskly they walked, the more briskly walked she. They were plainly bent upon taking a short, quick stroll before going indoors to lunch or dinner, to restore warmth to limbs chilled with sitting through a long service. Only one person had preceded Tess up the hill, a ladylike young woman, somewhat interesting, though perhaps a trifle guindée and prudish. Tess had nearly overtaken her when the speed of her brothers-in-law brought them so nearly behind her back that she could hear every word of their conversation. They said nothing, however, which particularly interested her, till, observing the young lady still further in front, one of them remarked, "There is Mercy Chant. Let us overtake her." Tess knew the name. It was the woman who had been destined for Angel's life companion by his and her parents, and whom he probably would have married but for her intrusive self. She would have known as much without previous information, had she waited a moment, for one of the brothers proceeded to say, "Ah, poor Angel, poor Angel! I never see that nice girl without more and more regretting his precipitancy in throwing himself upon a dairymaid, or whatever she may be. It's a queer business apparently. Whether she has joined him yet or not I don't know, but she had not done so some months ago when I heard from him." "I can't say. He never tells me anything nowadays. His ill-considered marriage seems to have completed that estrangement from me which was begun by his extraordinary opinions." Tess beat up the long hill still faster, but she could not outwalk them without exciting notice. At last they outsped her altogether and passed her by. The young lady still further ahead heard their footsteps and turned. Then there was a greeting and a shaking of hands, and the three went on together. They soon reached the summit of the hill, and evidently intending this point to be the limit of their promenade, slackened pace and turned all three aside to the gate whereat Tess had paused an hour before that time to reconnoitre the town before descending into it. During their discourse one of the clerical brothers probed the hedge carefully with his umbrella and dragged something to light. "Here is an old pair of boots," he said. "Thrown away, I suppose, by some tramp or other." "Some impostor who wished to come into the town barefoot, perhaps, and so excite our sympathies," said Miss Chant. "Yes, it must have been, for they are excellent walking boots, by no means worn out. What a wicked thing to do! I'll carry them home for some poor person." Cuthbert Clare, who had been the one to find them, picked them up for her with the crook of his stick, and Tess's boots were appropriated. She, who had heard this, walked past under the screen of her woollen veil till, presently looking back, she perceived that the church party had left the gate with her boots and retreated down the hill. Thereupon our heroine resumed her walk. Tears, blinding tears, were running down her face. She knew that it was all sentiment, all baseless impressibility, which had caused her to read the scene as to her own condemnation. Nevertheless, she could not get over it. She could not contravene in her own defenceless person all those untoward omens. It was impossible to think of returning to the vicarage. Angel's wife felt almost as if she had been hounded up that hill like a scorned thing by those, to her, superfine clerics. Innocently as the slight had been inflicted, it was somewhat unfortunate that she had encountered the sons and not the father, who, despite his narrowness, was far less starched and ironed than they, and had to the full the gift of charity. As she again thought of her dusty boots, she almost pitied those habiliments for the quizzing to which they had been subjected, and felt how hopeless life was for their owner. "Ah," she said, still sighing in pity for herself, "they don't know that I wore those over the roughest part of the road to save these pretty ones he bought for me. No, they did not know it, and they didn't think that he chose the colour of my pretty frock. No, how could they? If they had known, perhaps they would not have cared, for they don't care much for him, poor thing." Then she grieved for the beloved man whose conventional standard of judgment had caused her all these latter sorrows, and she went her way without knowing that the greatest misfortune of her life was this feminine loss of courage at the last and critical moment through her estimating her father-in-law by his sons. Her present condition was precisely one which would have enlisted the sympathies of old Mr. and Mrs. Clare. Their hearts went out of them at a bound towards extreme cases, when the subtle mental troubles of the less desperate among mankind failed to win their interest or regard. In jumping at publicans and sinners, they would forget that a word might be said for the worries of scribes and Pharisees, and this defect or limitation might have recommended their own daughter-in-law to them at this moment as a fairly choice sort of lost person for their love. Thereupon she began to plod back along the road by which she had come, not altogether full of hope, but full of a conviction that a crisis in her life was approaching. No crisis apparently had supervened, and there was nothing left for her to do but to continue upon that Starvacre farm till she could again summon courage to face the vicarage. she did indeed take sufficient interest in herself to throw up her veil on this return journey, as if to let the world see that she could at least exhibit a face such as Mercy Chant could not show. But it was done with a sorry shake of the head. "It is nothing, it is nothing," she said. "Nobody loves it, nobody sees it. Who cares about the looks of a castaway like me?" Her journey back was rather a meander than a march. It had no sprightliness, no purpose, only a tendency. Along the tedious length of Benville Lane she began to grow tired, and she leant upon gates and paused by milestones. She did not enter any house till, at the 7th or 8th mile, she descended the steep long hill below which lay the vicarage or townlet of Evershed, where in the morning she had breakfasted with such contrasting expectations. The cottage by the church, in which she again sat down, was almost the first at that end of the village, and while the woman fetched her some milk from the pantry, Tess, looking down the street, perceived that the place seemed quite deserted. "The people are gone to the afternoon service, I suppose," she said. "No, my dear," said the old woman. "'Tis too soon for that. The bells hain't shook out yet. They be all gone to hear the preaching in yonder barn. A ranter preaches there between the services, an excellent fiery Christian man, they say, but Lord, I don't go to hearing. What comes in the regular way over the pulpit is hot enough for I." Tess soon went onward into the village, her footsteps echoing against the houses as though it was a place of the dead. Nearing the central part, her echoes were intruded on by other sounds, and seeing the barn not far off the road, she guessed these to be the utterances of the preacher. His voice became so distinct in the still clear air that she could soon catch his sentences, though she was on the closed side of the barn. The sermon, as might be expected, was of the extremest antinomian type, on justification by faith, as expounded in the theology of St. Paul. This fixed idea of the rhapsodist was delivered with animated enthusiasm, in a manner entirely declamatory, for he had plainly no skill as a dialectician. Although Tess had not heard the beginning of the address, she heard what the text had been from its constant iteration. "O fool Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you?" Tess was all the more interested, as she stood listening behind, in finding that the preacher's doctrine was of a vehement form of the view of Angel's father, and her interest intensified when the speaker began to detail his own spiritual experiences of how he had come by those views. He had, he said, been the greatest of sinners. He had scoffed, he had wantonly associated with the reckless and the lewd. But a day of awakening had come, and in a human sense it had been brought about mainly by the influence of a certain clergyman whom he had at first grossly insulted, but whose parting words had sunk into his heart and had remained there till, by the grace of heaven, they had worked this change in him and made him what they saw him. But more startling to Tess than the doctrine had been the voice, which, impossible as it seemed, was precisely that of Alec d'Urberville. Her face fixed in painful suspense, she came round to the front of the barn and passed before it. The low winter sun beamed directly upon the great double-doored entrance on this side, one of the doors being open, so that the rays stretched far in over the threshing floor to the preacher and his audience, all snugly sheltered from the northern breeze. The listeners were entirely villagers, among them being the man whom she had seen carrying the red paint-pot on a formal memorable occasion. But her attention was given to the central figure, who stood upon some sacks of corn, facing the people and the door. The 3 o'clock sun shone full upon him, and the strange enervating conviction that her seducer confronted her, which had been gaining ground in Tess ever since she had heard his words distinctly, was at last established as a fact indeed. End of chapter 44 and end of phase the 5th.